Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Some nights change everything. Mine was supposed to be ordinary. A weekend visit to my in-laws, my 6-year-old daughter Amy tucked beside me in the guest room, while my wife Sandra chatted with her parents downstairs. Instead, it became the night I learned that the woman I'd loved for 8 years, the mother of my child, had been systematically destroying my life piece by piece. And Gary Stevenson, my former business partner and supposed best friend, had been helping her do it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began. Not that night in the guest room, but 3 months earlier when I first noticed the cracks in what I thought was my perfect life. My name is Edward Roberts, and until recently, I believed I was living the American dream. I'd built a successful construction company from nothing, starting with a single crew truck and expanding into commercial development across 3 counties. Sandra and I had met in college. She was studying marketing while I was grinding through business classes and working construction jobs to pay tuition. She was beautiful, ambitious, and when she smiled at me the first time in the campus coffee shop, I knew I'd found my future. We married young, maybe too young, but felt right. Sandra joined my business as the marketing director, and for the first few years, we were unstoppable. She had a natural talent for client relations and presentation, while I focused on the actual construction and project management. Our daughter Amy came along when we'd been married 3 years, and everything seemed to fall into place perfectly. Gary Stevenson entered our lives when the business started expanding rapidly. I needed a partner who understood both construction and finance, and Gary had both skills plus the connections we needed for bigger contracts. He was older than me by 5 years, divorced, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made clients trust him immediately. Sandra liked him from the start, which should have been my first warning. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The way Sandra would light up when Gary walked into a room. How their conversations would stop abruptly when I approached. The business trips they needed to take together for client meetings that somehow never materialized into contracts. But I was focused on building something lasting, something I could pass down to Amy someday. I trusted Sandra completely, and I trusted Gary because Sandra vouched for him. The first real crack appeared in February. We were bidding on a massive residential development project, 47 homes in a new subdivision outside the city. It was the kind of contract that could set us up for years, the breakthrough project I'd been working towards since starting the company. Sandra and Gary had been handling most of the client meetings while I focused on the construction planning and cost analysis. 2 days before the bid deadline, I was working late in the office when I decided to review the client files one more time. That's when I found the discrepancy in the project specifications. According to our internal documents, the client wanted premium materials throughout: hardwood flooring, granite countertops, high-end fixtures. But when I cross-referenced with the original RFP, the specifications were completely different. Someone had altered our bid to include much cheaper materials while keeping the premium pricing. When I confronted Sandra about it the next morning, she seemed genuinely surprised. "That's strange," she said, frowning at the documents. Gary handled most of the client correspondence. Maybe there was a miscommunication. Gary's explanation was smooth and reasonable. The client changed their specifications during our last meeting, he told me. "I meant to update you, but with everything moving so fast, it slipped through the cracks. Don't worry, Ed. The margins are still good, and this way we're more competitive." It made sense, but something felt off. I've been in this business long enough to know that clients don't typically downgrade their specifications after requesting premium bids. Still, Gary seemed confident, and Sandra supported his version of events. I let it slide, but I started paying closer attention to the details. The pattern became clearer over the following weeks. Small discrepancies in contracts, client meetings that Gary claimed to have attended but had no documentation for, and most troubling, a growing distance between Sandra and me. She was working longer hours, taking calls in private, and when I tried to discuss business decisions, she deferred to Gary's judgment more often than not. The breaking point came in early March. I was reviewing our quarterly financials when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. We had 3 major projects running simultaneously, but the profit margins were far below what our bid should have generated. Either we were hemorrhaging money due to massive cost overruns, or someone was skimming funds. I spent the entire weekend going through every invoice, every payment, every expense report. What I found was a masterpiece of subtle embezzlement. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger obvious red flags. Just small, consistent overcharges on materials, inflated subcontractor fees, and phantom expenses that added up to nearly $200,000 over 6 months. The beauty of it was that the money wasn't disappearing into obvious personal accounts. It was being funneled through a complex network of shell companies and legitimate-looking business expenses. And every single fraudulent transaction had either Sandra's or Gary's signature on it. I could have confronted them immediately. Part of me wanted to storm into the office Monday morning and demand explanations. But 8 years of marriage had taught me to read Sandra's tells, and I'd seen the way she'd been acting lately. The careful conversations, the guarded expressions, the way she'd changed the subject whenever I brought up long-term business plans. This wasn't just about money. This was something bigger, something more personal. So I did what any good contractor does when he finds structural damage. I started investigating the foundation. I hired a private investigator, a discreet ex-cop named Daniel Carpenter who specialized in corporate fraud and matrimonial cases. Within 2 weeks, Daniel had confirmed what I'd already suspected. Sandra and Gary weren't just stealing from the company. They were planning to push me out entirely. They've been building relationships with our major clients, positioning themselves as the real brains behind Robert's construction while painting me as the muscle who didn't understand the business side. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Daniel showed me the photographs. "I'm sorry, Edward," he said, sliding the manila envelope across his desk. "I know this isn't what you wanted to find." The photos were crystal clear. Sandra and Gary at a restaurant I'd never heard of, holding hands across the table. Sandra and Gary entering a downtown apartment that Gary apparently rented under a false name. Sandra and Gary in bed together, clearly intimate, clearly comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of a long-term relationship, not a momentary indiscretion. I stared at the photos for a long time, feeling something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest. This wasn't just betrayal. It was calculated destruction. They weren't just having an affair. They were systematically dismantling everything I'd built, stealing my money, my business, and my wife, and they were planning to leave me with nothing. "How long?" I asked Daniel. "Based on what I can document, at least 18 months. Probably longer." 18 months. Amy had been 4 years old when this started. While I was working 60-hour weeks to build a future for my family, my wife and my business partner were planning my destruction. While I was helping Amy with her homework and teaching her to ride a bike, Sandra was meeting Gary in that downtown apartment, sharing not just her body, but our secrets, our financial information, our client relationships. "There's more," Daniel said carefully. "They've been meeting with a lawyer, James Morrison. He specializes in business dissolution and custody cases." The room seemed to tilt. "Custody cases? I don't have details yet, but Morrison has a reputation for handling high-conflict divorces where one party is trying to prove the other is unfit for custody. His cases usually involve allegations of substance abuse, financial irresponsibility, or emotional instability. They were coming for Amy. They weren't just planning to destroy my business and my marriage. They were planning to take my daughter away from me. The cold feeling in my chest spread outward, filling my limbs with a kind of focused clarity I'd never experienced before. I thanked Daniel, paid his fee, and drove home in complete silence. Sandra was in the kitchen making dinner, humming something while she stirred a pot of sauce. Amy was at the table working on a coloring book, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth in concentration. "Daddy," she called out when I walked in. "Look what I made." It was a picture of our family, 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a crooked chimney. The words "my family" were written across the top in Amy's careful kindergarten handwriting. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, kissing the top of her head. And it was beautiful because it was innocent, because it was real, because Amy had no idea that the woman she called Mommy was planning to poison her against me. Sandra looked up from the stove with a smile that 3 hours earlier I would have found warm and genuine. Now I could see the calculation behind it. The careful performance of a woman who was already gone but still needed to maintain the facade. "Good day at work?" she asked. "Very productive," I replied. "I learned a lot." And I had learned a lot. I'd learned that my wife was a liar and a thief. I'd learned that my business partner was planning to steal everything I'd built. I'd learned that they were both willing to use my daughter as a weapon against me. But most importantly, I'd learned that I wasn't going to let any of that happen. The next few weeks were a careful balancing act. I continued my normal routine while secretly documenting everything. Every suspicious transaction, every private phone call Sandra took, every time Gary claimed to be meeting with clients who didn't exist. I installed discreet recording devices in my office and hired Daniel to maintain surveillance on both Sandra and Gary. Most importantly, I started making my own plans. Sandra and Gary thought they were smart, thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. They had no idea that I'd been building things my entire life, and I understood better than anyone how to tear them down. The opportunity came in April when Sandra suggested we visit her parents for Amy's spring break. "Mom and Dad haven't seen her in months," she said, "and you could use a break from work." I agreed immediately, recognizing it for what it was, a chance for Sandra to further distance Amy from me while she and Gary continued their planning. What Sandra didn't know was that I'd already been in contact with her father, a retired police detective named Lawrence Greer, who'd never fully trusted Gary and had started having his own suspicions about his daughter's behavior. "There's something you should know about Sandra," I'd told him during a private phone call. "Something that's going to hurt, but that you need to hear." Lawrence Greer was old-school law enforcement, the kind of man who believed in evidence over emotion. When I showed him Daniel's documentation and the financial records, his face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, disgust, and finally a cold determination that reminded me why career criminals had learned to fear him during his 30 years on the force. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need one night, one opportunity to catch them in their own trap." That opportunity came on our second night at the Greer house. Sandra had been unusually relaxed all day, laughing with her mother, playing with Amy in the backyard, acting like the loving wife and mother she'd once been. But after dinner, she started getting text messages that made her fidgety and distracted. "I need to step out for a bit," she announced around 9 o'clock. "Jenny Morrison is having some kind of crisis, and she asked me to come over." Jenny Morrison, the wife of the lawyer who'd been helping Sandra and Gary plan my destruction. Even her lies were getting lazy. "Take your time," I said, settling into the guest room with Amy for the night. "I'll get Amy ready for bed." What Sandra didn't know was that Gary Stevenson was already in the house. We were sleeping in the guest room at my in-laws' house when I heard footsteps in the hallway. As I tried to get up, my 6-year-old daughter grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't move, keep pretending to sleep." The door slowly opened, and someone entered the room. What I saw through half-closed eyes made me swallow a scream, not because of what I saw, but because of what I finally understood. Gary Stevenson stood in the doorway, but he wasn't there to hurt us. He was there because this had all been planned. Sandra's sudden decision to visit her parents, her convenient excuse to leave the house, even Amy's placement in the guest room where Gary could access us easily. It was all part of their scheme. But Amy knew. Somehow, my 6-year-old daughter had figured out what the adults around her were planning, and she was trying to protect me. Gary moved quietly across the room, and I watched through barely open eyes as he placed something small and rectangular under the edge of the dresser. A recording device. They were planning to frame me for something, and they needed evidence that would hold up in court. I remained perfectly still as Gary crept back out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Amy's grip on my wrist relaxed slightly, but she didn't let go. "Daddy," she whispered, so quietly I could barely hear her. "I heard Mommy talking to Uncle Gary on the phone. She said they were going to play a trick on you tonight, but it wasn't a good trick. It was a mean trick." My heart broke and burned at the same time. Amy didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but she'd instinctively recognized that something was wrong. My daughter, who should have been innocent and protected, was trying to protect me instead. "You did good, sweetheart," I whispered back. "But now we need to be very quiet and very still, okay?" She nodded against my shoulder, and we waited. Sandra returned 20 minutes later. I heard her talking quietly with her mother in the living room, then her footsteps coming down the hallway. But instead of going to the master bedroom, where she was supposed to be sleeping, she stopped outside the guest room door. "Gary," she whispered. "He's out cold." Gary's voice came from somewhere nearby. He'd been hiding in the hallway bathroom. "Kid 2, the recording device is in place. And you're sure this will work? Trust me. Tomorrow morning, you'll discover the device and the recordings of Edward talking in his sleep about the financial irregularities. Combined with Daniel Morrison's psychiatric evaluation, it'll be enough to prove he's mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to Amy." Daniel Morrison. Not James Morrison, the lawyer, but his brother, a psychiatrist who specialized in custody evaluations. They'd thought of everything. "What about the money?" Sandra asked. "Already transferred to the Cayman accounts we set up. By the time the auditors figure out the real scope of the embezzlement, Edward will be facing both criminal charges and a competency hearing. You'll get full custody of Amy, control of the company, and enough liquid assets to disappear if things get complicated. And us, we'll be free. New identities if necessary. New life, no more pretending. Amy will adjust eventually. Kids are resilient." I felt something snap inside my chest. They weren't just planning to destroy me. They were planning to kidnap my daughter and disappear with her. The recording device wasn't just about framing me for mental instability. It was about creating enough legal chaos to buy themselves time to vanish with Amy and the money. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated Lawrence Greer. "Sandra." Her father's voice came from the living room, calm and authoritative. "Could you come here for a moment?" I heard Sandra's sharp intake of breath, followed by Gary's muttered curse. Footsteps moved quickly toward the living room, and I knew the trap was about to close. "Amy," I whispered, "I need you to stay right here and count to 100 very slowly. No matter what you hear, don't come out of this room until you finish counting. Okay?" She nodded solemnly, and I eased out of bed, moving as quietly as Gary had moments before. The recording device was exactly where I'd seen him place it. A small digital recorder that would have captured hours of manufactured evidence against me. I pocketed the device and crept toward the living room, where Lawrence Greer was conducting his own interrogation. "Called Edward this afternoon," he was saying. "Explained everything. The financial records, the private investigators' reports, even the meetings with the Morrison brothers. Did you really think you could run this kind of operation under my roof? Dad, I don't know what Edward told you, but—" "Sandra." Lawrence's voice cut through his daughter's protest like a blade. "I've been a cop for 30 years. I know what guilty looks like, and I know what panic sounds like. Gary, you might want to think carefully about your next move." I reached the edge of the living room and saw Gary standing near the front door, his hand inside his jacket. Lawrence sat calmly in his armchair, but his service revolver lay on the table beside him, and his eyes never left Gary's face. "This doesn't have to get complicated," Gary said. "We can work this out like adults." "You're right," I said, stepping into the room. "It doesn't have to get complicated." Gary spun toward me, his hand coming out of his jacket with a small pistol. But Lawrence Greer had 30 years of experience dealing with desperate people, and his hand moved faster than Gary's. "Drop it," Lawrence said quietly, his own weapon now trained on Gary's center mass. "Drop it now, or I'll drop you." Gary looked around the room, at Sandra's pale face, at Lawrence's steady aim, at me standing calmly near the doorway. He was a businessman, not a killer, and the math was simple. He placed his gun on the coffee table and raised his hands. "Smart choice," Lawrence said. "Edward, would you mind calling Detective Morrison? Tell him we have a situation that requires immediate attention." "Morrison?" Sandra asked weakly. "Daniel Morrison's older brother," Lawrence explained. "The one who's been running the financial crimes unit for the past 5 years. Amazing how small the world is, isn't it?" The next hour moved quickly. Detective Morrison arrived with 2 patrol units and processed the scene with professional efficiency. The recording device I'd recovered was entered into evidence, along with Gary's weapon and the financial documents Lawrence had been accumulating for weeks. Sandra tried to maintain her innocence at first, claiming she'd been manipulated by Gary, that she hadn't known about the embezzlement or the custody scheme. But when Detective Morrison showed her the photographs Daniel Carpenter had taken, along with the bank records Lawrence had helped me compile, her story fell apart completely. "You knew about this," she accused her father. "You helped him set us up." "I helped him protect his daughter," Lawrence replied. "My granddaughter. You were planning to kidnap Amy and disappear with stolen money. Did you think I'd stand by and let that happen?" Gary, meanwhile, had decided that cooperation was his best option. Facing charges for embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping, he started talking almost immediately. The scope of their scheme was even larger than I'd realized. They'd been planning to frame me for mental instability while simultaneously making it appear that I'd stolen money from the company to feed a gambling addiction they were going to fabricate. The beauty of it, Gary explained to Detective Morrison, was that Edward would be facing criminal charges and a competency hearing simultaneously. Sandra would get emergency custody of Amy, and by the time the legal system sorted everything out, we'd be in a non-extradition country with new identities. Whose idea was it? Morrison asked. Gary glanced at Sandra, who was staring at the floor. Joint effort. Sandra knew Edward's routines and weaknesses. I provided the financial expertise and the connections to make it work. As dawn broke over the Greer house, Sandra and Gary were transported to the county jail to await arraignment. I sat in the guest room with Amy, who had waited patiently through the entire ordeal, counting to 100 over and over again until I came back for her. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" she asked. "No, sweetheart. We're safe now." "Is Mommy in trouble?" That was the hardest question of all. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother had been willing to destroy her father's life and kidnap her to cover up a crime? How do you maintain a child's faith in the world when the adults she trusted most had proven themselves capable of such calculated cruelty? "Mommy made some very bad choices," I said finally, "and now she has to face the consequences of those choices. Like when I break something and have to clean it up? Something like that, but much more serious." Amy nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the resilience that had carried her through the entire ordeal. "Can we go home now?" "Soon," I promised. "But first, Daddy has some work to finish." The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. With Gary's cooperation and the mountain of evidence Lawrence and I had compiled, both Sandra and Gary pled guilty to multiple felonies. The embezzlement charges alone carried potential sentences of 10 to 15 years, but the conspiracy and attempted kidnapping charges elevated the case to federal court. Sandra's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal based on her role as a mother and claims that Gary had manipulated her, but Detective Morrison's investigation had uncovered evidence that Sandra had been the primary architect of the custody scheme. The recordings of her phone calls with the Morrison brothers, combined with her detailed knowledge of my daily routines and business practices, painted a picture of a woman who had been planning my destruction for months. But the legal victory was only the beginning of my revenge. Sandra and Gary had spent 18 months systematically destroying my life, stealing my money, and planning to take my daughter away from me. A few years in federal prison wasn't enough. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to lose everything that mattered to them. Gary had been married before, and his ex-wife had custody of his 2 teenage children. During the investigation, I'd learned that Gary had been paying minimal child support while spending lavishly on his affair with Sandra. I made sure his ex-wife's attorney received copies of all the financial records showing Gary's hidden assets and expensive lifestyle. The subsequent child support modification hearing resulted in Gary owing over $60,000 in back support, with his assets frozen until the debt was satisfied. But Gary's real weakness wasn't money. It was his reputation. He'd built his career on being the smooth, reliable partner that contractors could trust with their biggest projects. I spent 3 months methodically contacting every client Gary had ever worked with, every contractor who had considered hiring him, every business association he belonged to. I didn't slander him or make false accusations. I simply shared the public court records and let them draw their own conclusions. By the time Gary was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, his professional reputation was completely destroyed. Even if he served only half his sentence, he'd never work in construction again. Sandra's punishment required more finesse. She'd been the marketing face of Roberts Construction, the woman who'd charmed clients and built relationships throughout the industry. Those relationships were based on trust, and trust was easy to destroy once people understood how completely Sandra had betrayed it. I started by sending a carefully worded letter to every client Sandra had ever worked with, explaining that Roberts Construction was undergoing a restructuring following the departure of key personnel due to financial irregularities. I included news clippings about the embezzlement case and expressed my commitment to rebuilding the company's reputation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Clients who had worked with Sandra for years called to express their shock and to assure me of their continued confidence in my integrity. Several offered to provide character references for any legal proceedings. Most importantly, they started referring new business to Roberts Construction, impressed by my honesty in handling the situation. But Sandra's real punishment wasn't professional. It was personal. She'd been willing to use Amy as a weapon against me, to poison my daughter's mind and steal her away from everything she'd ever known. For that, there could be no forgiveness. I filed for divorce immediately, citing adultery and financial crimes. Sandra's attorney tried to argue for joint custody, claiming that Sandra's crimes were against me, not against Amy. But the recordings Gary had made of their planning sessions included detailed discussions of how they would manipulate Amy's feelings toward me and eventually convince her that her father was dangerous. The family court judge, after reviewing the evidence, granted me full custody with supervised visitation for Sandra. The visits would take place in a state facility with a court-appointed monitor present at all times. Sandra would have no unsupervised contact with Amy until she completed psychological counseling and demonstrated that she posed no risk of parental alienation or kidnapping. "She's my daughter, too," Sandra pleaded during the final custody hearing, tears streaming down her face. "I made mistakes, but I love her. You were willing to kidnap her and disappear to another country," I replied. "You were willing to convince her that her father was mentally unstable and dangerous. That's not love, that's possession." The judge agreed. Sandra would serve 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. By the time she was released, Amy would be 17 years old enough to make her own decisions about contact with her mother. But my revenge wasn't complete yet. There was still the matter of the money. Gary and Sandra had stolen nearly $400,000 from Roberts Construction over 18 months, but federal investigators had only recovered about half that amount from their various accounts. The rest had been spent on their affair, expensive restaurants, luxury hotel rooms, the downtown apartment Gary had rented for their meetings. Under federal restitution laws, Gary and Sandra were jointly responsible for repaying the full amount, plus interest and penalties. With both of them facing lengthy prison sentences, that debt would accrue interest for years before they could even begin making payments. I could have written off the loss and moved on. Roberts Construction was financially stable, and the business was actually thriving thanks to the publicity surrounding my handling of the embezzlement. But I wanted Gary and Sandra to understand that their actions had consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. I hired a collections attorney who specialized in restitution cases and gave him explicit instructions. Pursue every legal avenue to collect the debt, place liens on any assets Gary and Sandra might acquire in the future, and make sure they understood that their theft would follow them until every penny was repaid with interest. The psychological impact was exactly what I'd hoped for. Gary's letters from prison grew increasingly desperate as he realized that his financial obligations would make it virtually impossible for him to rebuild his life after release. Sandra's family, who had initially supported her, gradually distanced themselves as the full scope of her crimes became clear and the financial restitution demands mounted. 6 months after their sentencing, I received a letter from Sandra. It was written on prison stationery, and her once confident handwriting looked shaky and uncertain. "Edward," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to try to explain. I never meant for things to go so far. Gary convinced me that you were holding me back, that I deserved more than what our marriage offered. I got caught up in the excitement of it all, and I lost sight of what really mattered. I know I hurt you, and I know I hurt Amy. If there's any way you could find it in your heart to forgive me. I stopped reading and threw the letter away. Forgiveness was for people who made mistakes, who acted impulsively, who regretted their actions and sought to make amends. Sandra and Gary had spent 18 months carefully planning my destruction. They had been willing to steal my money, destroy my reputation, and kidnap my daughter. That wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated attack on everything I held dear. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, no second chances. They had chosen their path, and now they would walk it to the end. The final piece of my revenge came 2 years later, when Gary was granted parole after serving only 4 years of his sentence. He was released to a halfway house in a city 300 miles away, with restrictions on his movement and mandatory reporting requirements. I'd been monitoring his progress through the correction system, and I knew he would try to rebuild his life in construction. It's what he knew, what he was good at, and with his options limited by his criminal record, it would be his only realistic path back to financial stability. I was ready for him. Every time Gary applied for a job, I made sure the employer received a comprehensive package of information about his criminal history, his role in the embezzlement scheme, and his betrayal of his business partner's trust. I didn't lie or exaggerate. I simply made sure that potential employers had all the facts they needed to make informed decisions. Gary tried working for small contractors who might be willing to overlook his past, but word traveled quickly in the construction industry. Within 6 months, he was unemployable in any capacity that involved handling money or client relationships. He tried starting his own small handyman business, but the restitution garnishments took most of his earnings before he could even cover his basic living expenses. The financial pressure, combined with his inability to rebuild his professional reputation, drove him to increasingly desperate measures. 3 years after his release, Gary contacted me directly. "Edward," he said when I answered the phone, "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to ask you something." "Go ahead. Why? Why are you still doing this?" "I paid for what I did. I served my time. I'm trying to rebuild my life, but every time I get close to some kind of stability, you tear it down. I get that you're angry, but when does it end?" "When you've lost everything that matters to you," I replied. "The way you planned for me to lose everything that mattered to me. That was different. We never meant. You meant to steal my money, destroy my reputation, and kidnap my daughter. You meant to frame me for mental instability and leave me with nothing. The only reason it didn't work was because you underestimated me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What do you want from me?" Gary asked finally. "I want you to understand what you did. I want you to feel what I felt when I discovered your betrayal. I want you to know what it's like to have someone systematically destroy everything you try to build. And Sandra made her choice. She chose you over her own daughter. She chose money over her marriage. She chose revenge over redemption. Now she lives with the consequences." Gary hung up without another word, and I never heard from him again. 6 months later, I learned through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to another state, changed his name, and was working under the table for cash-only construction jobs. He was living in a mobile home park, driving a 15-year-old pickup truck, and drinking too much. The restitution garnishments had driven him underground, where he'd remain for the rest of his working life. Sandra served her full 8-year sentence without parole. I attended every parole hearing to oppose her early release, bringing character witnesses and evidence of the ongoing psychological impact her crimes had on Amy. Each time, the parole board noted my opposition and denied Sandra's request. When Sandra was finally released, Amy was 16 years old and had no interest in rebuilding a relationship with her mother. Sandra tried reaching out through letters and phone calls, but Amy, now old enough to understand exactly what her mother had done, wanted nothing to do with her. "She tried to steal me away from you," Amy told me one evening as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset. "She was going to take me to another country and convince me that you were crazy. Why would I want to see her?" "People change," I said carefully. "Prison can make people reflect on their mistakes." Amy looked at me with the clear-eyed wisdom that comes from growing up too fast. "Do you think she's changed?" "I think she's learned that actions have consequences." "That's not the same thing." She was right, of course. Sandra hadn't changed. She'd just been forced to confront the reality of what she'd done. Her letters to Amy were full of self-pity and justification, not genuine remorse or responsibility. She blamed Gary for manipulating her, blamed me for being too focused on work, blamed everyone except herself for the choices she'd made. Amy saw through it all with a clarity that I'd never quite achieved. She understood that some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, that some actions reveal truths about a person's character that can never be unseen. 5 years after Sandra's release, Roberts Construction had grown into one of the most successful firms in the region. I'd remarried, a woman named Allison Allen who worked as an architect and understood both the challenges and rewards of building something lasting. Amy, now 21 and studying engineering, worked for the company during her summer breaks and had expressed interest in eventually taking over the business. Sandra, meanwhile, was working as a waitress in a small town 200 miles away. The restitution payments still took a significant portion of her wages, and her criminal record made it difficult to find better employment. She lived alone in a small apartment with no friends and no family relationships that had survived her betrayal. Gary had disappeared entirely. Some said he'd moved to Mexico to escape the restitution garnishments. Others claimed he'd died in a construction accident while working an off-the-books job. I didn't know the truth and I didn't care. He'd ceased to matter the moment he'd made the choice to betray me. On Amy's 21st birthday, as we celebrated with Allison and Lawrence Greer at the same house where everything had changed 13 years earlier, I reflected on the path that had brought us to this moment. Sandra and Gary had thought they were destroyers, but they'd really been builders. They'd built their own prison, constructed their own exile, architected their own destruction. They taught me something valuable about the nature of betrayal and the importance of consequences. Some people believe in forgiveness and redemption, in the possibility that anyone can change if given enough chances. But I learned that some actions reveal fundamental truths about a person's character, and those truths don't change just because the person faces consequences. Sandra hadn't loved me. She'd seen me as an obstacle to what she wanted. Gary hadn't been my friend. He'd seen me as a resource to be exploited. They'd both been willing to destroy an innocent child's life to achieve their goals, and that willingness came from something deep inside them that prison couldn't reach and time couldn't heal. "Dad," Amy said, interrupting my thoughts, "I want to propose a toast." She raised her glass of champagne, looking around the table at the people who had protected and supported her through the most difficult period of her life. To the people who choose love over greed, loyalty over betrayal, and truth over convenience. To the people who build things instead of tearing them down. We drank to that toast, and as I looked at my daughter, strong, intelligent, untainted by the poison her mother had tried to inject in her life, I knew that my revenge was complete. Sandra and Gary had lost everything they valued, but more importantly, they'd failed to destroy anything that truly mattered. Amy was safe. The business was thriving. The future I'd been building was secure. And Sandra and Gary were exactly where they belonged, forgotten, alone, and facing the consequences of their choices every day for the rest of their lives. Some people say that revenge is a dish best served cold. But I learned something different. Revenge isn't about temperature. It's about patience, precision, and understanding your enemy's deepest vulnerabilities. Sandra and Gary had thought they were playing a game where the winner takes everything. They'd never realized that I was playing a different game entirely, one where the loser loses everything forever. In the end, that made all the difference. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.